Hello, how is everyone doing this morning? Hope everyone's having a good start to their weekend so far. So let's get on with this book because we're almost done. This should be the last book reading. Good morning, Carl. Because we're on page, how many pages do we have? This book is 224 pages. We're on page 169. Oh, I should have kept reading for at least 5 more pages yesterday. Good morning, Carl. I think we'll get through it. War makes it hard to discern what is true. It has always been thus. Wars are made possible, sustained, and won or lost through deceit and the confusion of reference. The lies of war extend even into its most basic physical operations. Strategy, Elaine Scarry writes, does not simply entail lies, but it essentially and centrally a verbal act of lying. Codes, for instance, are attempts to make meaning irrecoverable, and in camouflage, the principles of lying is carried forward into the materialized self-expression of clothing, shelter, and other structures. War, she writes, is defined by its disappearing content. It is by its nature a matter of cover-ups. In Iraq, the United States used a blanket of propaganda about smart bombs and high-tech postmodern warfare to cover up the reality of civilian targeting cluster bomblets and radioactive dust from depleted uranium-tipped shells. And it covered up the reality of failures on the ground with a campaign of essentially fictional letters to the editor from the soldiers extolling successes. Just so, in a moment of wrenching symbolism, UN officials draped a shroud over their tapestry of Picasso's Guernica as Security Council members discussed the possibility of war in Iraq, lest the international media stamp a picture of an official near their arresting anti-war image. In Gabe Hudson's comically macabre tirade, Dear Mr. President, a twitchingly nervous George Bush Sr. will only visit soldiers behind a vision-obscuring gas mask. Hudson makes his refusal to see a primary metaphor, not only for wartime culture, but also for what happens after combat ceases, especially with the bodies of injured soldiers. While Hudson's veterans sprout third ears and disintegrate into human blobs, the U.S. government steadfastly denies Gulf War syndrome, and Veteran Affairs doctors diagnose stress and prescribe Prozac. Ian Burma recalls seeing, in the 1970s and 80s, the blind and maimed veterans of the Imperial Army standing on crude artificial limbs on the halls of railway stations, begging for spare change, quietly ignored. It is difficult to gaze upon injured bodies after war, to acknowledge both the depth and the durability of damage. It is also difficult after war to look carefully at the reasons for going in the first place. The original public explanations and exhortations, once so bright and clear, once so emotionally overwhelming, seemed by the end so misguided, so misleading, so disproportionate to the reality of amputated limbs and burn scarring. And when alternative explanations for why we fought inevitably begin to emerge, it is especially painful. 4 years after President Bush declared a mission accomplished in Iraq, Naomi Klein insisted that U.S. attempts to privatize the country and to privatize war itself were central rather than incidental goals. Just 8 days after announcing the end of combat operations in Iraq, she notes, President Bush revealed his hand by calling for the establishment of a United States Middle East free trade area within a decade. 2 weeks after arriving in Baghdad, he himself described as on fire, Paul Bremer declared the country open for business. As Klein was told by a delegate at the Second Rebuilding Iraq Conference, the best time to invest is when there is still blood on the ground. During the first Gulf War in 1991, Klein writes, there was one contractor for every 100 soldiers. 4 years into the Iraq War, there was one contractor for every 1.4 U.S. soldiers. Halliburton alone received $20 billion in contracts, almost 4 times the entire UN peacekeeping budget for 2006 to 2007. Paul Bremer played his part in funneling money to such corporations by barring Iraq's central bank from providing finances for state-owned enterprises, effectively slashing away at its public sector infrastructure. Free market fervor, Klein argues, extended over to the post-innovation looting. Peter McPherson, senior economic advisor to Paul Bremer, said that when he saw Iraqis taking state property, cars, buses, ministry equipment, it didn't bother him. Describing the pillaging as a form of public sector shrinkage, he commented, I thought the privatization that occurs sort of naturally when somebody took over their state vehicle or began to drive a truck that the state used to own was just fine. The rise of private mercenary armies, chillingly documented in Germany, Scahill's Blackwater was inevitable under such leadership. Comparing U.S. nation-building in Iraq to nation-building in Japan after World War II, John Dower writes, just as in Iraq, creating a sound capitalist economy was always a goal in Japan. What was understood as capitalism, and sound as well, was another matter entirely. After World War II, it was taken for granted that the state, that is, the U.S. and Japanese governments, had to play a major role in economic development. Hi, Dirty Mac. By contrast, once the Americans found themselves plunged willy-nilly into reconstructing Iraq, they pursued this with a zealotry that reflected the reigning dogmas for market fundamentalism. Privatization became the catechism of these latecomers to nation building. At one critically early point, much of occupied Iraq's economy appeared to have been put up for sale. At every point, an immense portion of the tasks and functions involved in planning and directing civil affairs in the shattered nation were outsourced to private and largely American contractors. Even civil affairs, even intelligence gathering, even security, even reconstruction endeavors that in Japan had been left to the Japanese and could have been done by Iraqis with greater efficiency and far less expense. The result was a level of confusion, cronyism, and non-transparency and corruption that had no counterpart in Japan. In an article entitled, Let's All Go to the Yard Sale, The Economist described Iraq, with its new 15% flat tax for individuals and corporations and its tariffs eliminated or slashed to 5%, as a capitalist dream. While it will be impossible to ever fully track all of our spending on the war, Linda Bilmes and Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz put it at $3 trillion. Even in the best-case scenario, they write, these costs are projected to be almost 10 times the cost of the first Gulf War, almost a third more than what the cost of the Vietnam War, and twice that of the First World War. The only war in our history which cost more was the Second World War, when 16.3 million U.S. troops fought in a campaign lasting 4 years at a total cost in 2007 dollars after adjusting for inflation of about $5 trillion. That's 5 million or 2.5 million pounds. Or no, is that pounds? I don't know. With virtually the entire armed forces committed to fighting the Germans and Japanese, the cost per troop in today's dollars was less than $100,000 in 2007 dollars. By contrast, the Iraq War is costing upwards of $400,000 per troop. Hi, Wendy. In the unflinching documentary War Tapes, a staff sergeant offers a telling detail. Army truck drivers make $17,000 a year. You know, E5s, so they outsource it, privatize, save the Army money. And now we pay KBR, Halliburton, $120,000 to do the same job. Another soldier complains about the KBR convoys. Why the fuck am I sitting here guarding this truck full of cheesecake? Are these people crazy? I feel like the priority of KBR making money outweighs the priority of safety. War profiteering and business government collusion have always been sources of moral nausea in post-war discourse. From John Dos Passos' claim that World War I provided good growing weather for the House of Morgan, to Anthony Swofford's grim joke about being transferred from the Marine Corps to the Oil Corps, his life squandered to secure the financial interests of Bush Sr. and Sons. In the United States, when we evaluate the cost of war afterwards, the appalling expense of blood and treasure paid by some, and the astonishing profit gained by others, we are always surprised. After photographs were released in 2004 depicting prisoner abuse at Abu Ghraib, I began to receive invitations to speak at non-academic public forums to discuss the war in Iraq. In the Q&As, conversations inevitably turn to torture. Is torture effective? What separates torture from coercion? Are we torturing? In particular, people wanted to ask about waterboarding. What is it? What does it look like? They wanted to know what we were doing and how they feel about it. It was curiosity as civic duty. Hi, Charlotte. Sometimes in these conversations, I was reminded of a book reviewed by J.M. Coetzee called Into the Dark Chamber about torture novels. Coetzee wanted to explain why writers in South Africa seem to have a dark fascination with torture. The torture room, he wrote, is a site of extreme human experience, accessible to no one save the participants. Novelists and readers stand outside the door, wanting to enter the dark room, but unable to. In creating obscenity and enveloping it in mystery, the state creates the preconditions for the novel to set about its work. The torture chamber, Coetzee concluded, is the origin of a particular kind of fantasy. So what does waterboarding look like? And that's the end of that sentence. Now we're going to talk about Sakakura-san. He said, Sakakura-san says, and so I, with my buddies, the three of us, we got one man, a 35, 36-year-old burly man, We took him inside a house, and then we broke down a door and went in where the door was, and that man, we made him lie on top of the door. Lie here, we said. He looked up at us dumbfounded, so dumbfounded. And then we all pushed him down and tied him down, his hands and legs, here and here, both of his hands. We tied all of that to the door. And then here he got angry, Why are you tying me up? Yelling at us like that a few times. But since we'd already tied him up tight with rope, once bound like that, you can't move. And it's just, where do you go from here? With the older soldier had experience, so he said, go draw some water. Well, I went and got some water, and after that he said, go get me a rag. And I got a rag, any sort of cloth, anything will do, just get me a rag. And then he said, now make him drink some water. And so he put the rag on his head, and then I put the spout of the kettle up to his nose, and glug, 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 I poured water into him. And then, while I was making him drink, I asked, are there any weapons here? Where is the 8th Route Army? And while we were asking these questions, he looked pained, withering and blubbering. Well, at first, the water didn't go in too well. However, as it did, gradually, water got into his air pipe. And then, even still, we continued, no matter how much it hurt. Stop, stop. And he was just completely exhausted. Don't know nothing about the 8th route, he said. And while we were doing this kind of thing, when we'd been doing this about 30 minutes, then the guy's stomach had grown out like this, because we've been making him drink water, With the cloth on your face like that, you'll just keep on drinking water, Every time you breathe, no matter how much you don't want to, you'll drink. So you should take the cloth off. But your hands are tied up, right? Your legs are tied up too. So all you do is thrash, squirm around, and shaking. Your head doesn't do much either, because there's somebody holding your head. And then, because he's been drinking, his stomach had swollen now. The old soldier said, good, then took his foot and placed it on the man's stomach, and bam, he stomped on it. Water shot out of his mouth, and he shot out blood too. Yeah, even then, I don't know nothing, he said. And so we kept on doing it, all of it, for an hour. We just kept on doing it, making him vomit water, making him drink it again. About an hour passed that way. But if he won't talk even with all this, maybe we should make him drink some shochu, Japanese liquor, make him drink some alcohol. And so now I went to look for some alcohol, and since it was the Chinese New Year, every house had alcohol in it. So I searched out and brought back alcohol from who knows how many houses. And this time we took away the rag that was up against his face and changed it for a new one. And now we slowly, from the nose, from the mouth, made him drink the shochu. There's no way to make him drink it all at once. So to make him drink it, we pour little by little, and we thought he was drinking it pretty well. We brought 20 bottles or so, or was it more? We made him drink most of that. And then in the end, when it was finally the end, I'll talk, he said. And we thought, we did it. We untied his rope and made him stand. He couldn't stand, so we lent him a hand. And the place we went, where are we going? I thought. And we went into the house where there's a heater, And he said, it's here. And he shut his eyes. Here. They are in here, he said. This ridiculous. It's just weird. There's no way there could be weapons in a place like this, I thought. And then the man just flopped right down. And that was the end. And my boss said it was hopeless. And we just left him like that. Sakura-san's wife died long ago. He lives with his adopted daughter, her husband, and grandchild. At the time of this writing, he was hospitalized but in stable condition for complications from dialysis. Okay. Douglas Johnson was recently the executive director of the Center of Victims of Torture in the Twin Cities. When international controversy over U.S. torture in Abu Ghraib was at its height, he gave a public lecture that I attended. In that, he discussed the intelligence value of torture in the famous tickling time bomb scenario. The tickling time bomb is a thought experiment designed to torment people who are moral absolutists about torture, who condemn it without exception. What if there's a bomb somewhere in New York City about to go off? Would you torture the person who knows where it is and how to defuse it? What if the bomb will kill 100 people? Is a terrorist worth more than 100 innocent lives? Is your moral purity worth more than 100 lives? What if it will kill 1,000 people? Is a terrorist worth more than 1,000 innocent lives? Is your moral purity worth more than 1,000 lives? And so on. There's a number where every sane absolutist breaks down and hypothetically authorizes torture. But this is science fiction, Johnson explains. This is how torture works. Let me give you a more realistic case. There's a bomb in a nearby shopping mall. If it goes off, it will kill 100 or more people. Johnson pauses and looks around the lecture hall, as if searching for something among the 50 or so spectators. Then he locks his gaze on the first row. We know that somebody in the first row knows something about this bomb. Looking back at the rest of the audience, he asks, would you be willing to torture them all to find out who this person is, or what or he or she knows? I am not sitting in the first row. He continues, okay, let's imagine this. We know somebody in the first 2 rows knows something about this bomb. Would you be willing to torture them all to find out who this person is and what he or she knows? The first 3 rows, this lecture hall, and so on. There is a number where every sane torture defender breaks down. In 1942, writes Yuki Tanaka, operatives of the Kempeitai, a special Japanese military force, raided a home in Banjarmasin and found a radio transmitter that they believed locals were using to communicate with Allied forces. And the investigation that followed, 257 people were tortured and murdered. While this was happening, a groundless rumor of a radio being used in Pontianak popped up. Eventually, more than 1,500 civilians were arrested, and most of them were tortured and killed. Tanaka explains, Kempeitai members were projecting their fears onto the local population and thus constantly discovering new conspiracies. They were usually convinced of the guilt of those arrested before any interrogation had taken place. The confessions extracted after days, weeks, or even months of torture were usually given by victims who would confess to anything, even crimes punishable by death, in order to end their ordeal. Those named in such confessions would also be arrested and tortured, so the circle of false confession and torture would widen and fuel the paranoia of the Kempeitai operatives, who became increasingly convinced that they had uncovered a comprehensive network of resistance activity. This is the common pattern. Torture produces bad information, and a lot of it. Torture one innocent, and you will eventually get a list of names. The person you are torturing will say anything to make you stop, and she thinks you want names. So now you have a handful of names. These people are, of course, innocent, but you cannot know that, so you will torture them too. Some will take longer than others, but eventually you will find that each of these people also has a list of names to give you. Now you have a conspiracy unraveling in front of you. You are now onto something. Security resources are scarce and occupied elsewhere, but this is important. Resources will simply have to be redirected. But torture doesn't only produce bad information, it also shuts down good information. Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, Kenneth Roth, claims that among intelligence personnel, it is widely agreed that the best source of information comes from cooperative communities providing information and tips. In Iraq, he explains, Muslim communities stopped cooperating with the United States once it became clear that they were using torture. Why would anybody provide information about a peculiar or suspicious activity if that might lead to a cruel and inhumane treatment of Muslims or the torture of innocents? Who would want that on their conscience? Best to keep quiet. But this is not to say that torture is never effective. Exactly. Apologists for torture, for instance, will often cite as evidence in their favor the French victory over FLN, National Liberation Front, guerrillas in the Battle of Algiers. Here, too, torture was deemed generally ineffective for getting information. But that fact, as we will see, wasn't relevant. The first commander to officially use torture in the Battle of Algiers insisted infiltration and information obtained spontaneously from the population are the most useful methods. I repeat, the use of pushed interrogations, the euphemism for torture, is only valuable if one is dealing with someone who is certainly guilty and if the information can be immediately exploited. But torturers from the Battle of Algiers, Darius Rejali recounts, rarely found certainly guilty people with information that could be immediately exploited. No one cites his role in preventing a ticking time bomb from going off, Rejali writes. Such rumored successes always happen elsewhere and are things interrogators have only heard about. In fact, torturers regularly complained about the problem of false confessions and later laminated how the torture deprofessionalized soldiers and fragmented their military institutions. Nonetheless, torture was always used aggressively through the Battle of Algiers, and it did, temporarily, defeat the enemy. Why? Because torture isn't about getting information. It wasn't torture as a strategy for gathering information that defeated terrorism. It was torture as terrorism that worked. As Rejali recounts, approximately 1/3 of the city was arrested within 9 months, and at least 15 innocents were tortured for every FLN operative. This was a great way of winning a battle and closing down a city, even if it meant losing the war. Okay, now we're going back to Sakakura-san. Sakakura-san states, and on my way home, we came across them tying a woman to the roots of a big tree. They tied her up and then another soldier was holding her kid. And one guy, that woman, there was a woman, and they stuck out their bayonets. Where is it? Where are they? Where is it? They did these things and whatnot. And the mother, it was like she went crazy because the one we had under the bayonet wasn't the woman, it was her kid. They held the bayonet to the kid like this. Where are they? Where? They asked. And to get her to talk, they'd, do this to the kid, and the mother would go completely crazy, kick and scream, But even still, they didn't let the kid go. And they kept doing that sort of thing. And we thought, well, you see these things sometimes. And if you tell the company commander, well, the company commander went and rounded up 20 villagers and one, village leader. We took the village leader and hung him upside down by the branches of the gigantic willow tree with his hands, unclear what he said. And we just hung him there. Your bones slip out of the joints. And now the villagers will shout it, where are the weapons? Where's the 8th Route Army? We gathered that sort of information. Every time the villagers said there was no weapons here, no 8th Route Army. If you don't say it, if you bastards don't say, we will kill your village leader, we'd say. And then every time the villagers got mad. And whenever they got mad, we 20 or so soldiers closed ranks. And while we were doing that sort of thing over and over, the company commander finally said, this is useless. And he said to a subordinate officer, okay, cut him down. He ordered him. And the officer, he didn't have much choice, and it was the first time, of course. And so taking out your katana in front of everyone and chopping off a man's head and his legs were shaking a little, And then he cleaned the sword in a bucket of water, And then we lowered the village leader. We lowered the village leader from the tree and in front of the well. This well was dug out. Everywhere in China, there are these wells dug out of the ground, He made him sit by the well. And then the officer, he picked up the katana and whoosh, took his head off in a flash. His head thumped down in the front, and blood shot up about 2 meters into the sky. And just when I thought it was over, then he took his legs and gave him a swift, hard kick. That man, the village leader, popped down into the well, and that was the end. It was so easy, this sort of thing. Well, the way I really felt, was something like, won't they just give up information? It'd be great if we just had a such and such information. And, for us, it was a success, the merit we were after. In torturing and setting fires, if something really came of it, that would give an impact on our army record. And so if we didn't get what we wanted, we were disappointed. And so it wasn't a very good feeling when some enemy or civilian died. But we felt like if they do die, we don't care. At any rate, we were happy if we got information out of them. So that's success in the world, I suppose. Our record, we did the stuff thinking we were going to get a better record for it. When I went off to the army, my mother said, give him hell. She also said, when you go over there, don't get any weird diseases. That's what she said. Don't get any weird diseases, she said. And I remembered this. Well, don't get, any of the army's weird diseases. When I first got back home after meeting these men, I tried to tell people about it, but I didn't know how to explain things, how to turn any of it into coherent stories that could be shared. Something in me kept needing to try, though. I ended up saying inappropriate things at inappropriate times in inappropriate ways. I would start a story and then not know where to go with it, how to wrap it up, how to make it fit back into the flow of the reciprocal conversation. And so I find myself mouthing familiar bromides that allowed me to end my turn in the conversation, and that changed each time I spoke. How it made me cynical about people and about our collective future. How it made me see opportunities for change and reasons for hope. One time I found myself talking about these things these men did on the sidelines during a community soccer game. Another time in a holiday party chat or circle. The way people looked at me after that, I decided to be quiet. Over the next year, I spent a lot of time thinking about how to share these stories and about whether to. At the same time, I was teaching courses at my college on theoretical and ethical structures of storytelling and human rights. It all became knotted up together in my head so that I couldn't separate the specific practical questions about my own writing from the broader philosophical questions about the nature of writing in general. I felt like there was an answer, even though I wasn't sure about the question. It was like that feeling you get momentarily when you can't remember the name that is intimate to you. But in this case, the feeling lasted many months. Anyways, it's now years later, and I built my own twisted little walkway to something that feels like resolution. Where was I? Feels like resolution, or as close as. I'll manage. It winds itself around the ideas of storytelling and human dignity and advances through a series of interlocking pieces that culminate in a single sentence. Standing alone, it is an empty final sentence, but by the time you get to it, I hope you will see what it means. The path starts with the question I asked one of the soldiers who was, like me, a teacher. In advance of our meeting, this man was a worry for me. Hi, James. He specialized in ethics at the university under a prominent Japanese moral philosopher, loved Tolstoy, and immersed himself in the Shirakabaha literature, a literary movement that promoted individualism and humanism. He worked for the Ministry of Education after graduation, but as a man of conscience, quit in protest when asked to perform an ideology inspection on a scholar he admired. After that, he worked as a teacher at a teacher's college. He was then drafted and became a war criminal. You were the kind of man who disobeyed and sacrificed so many things before the war. I said to him, you spent all this time in China engaged in acts that strongly contradicted your philosophical position. How, besides rationalizing his orders, did you make sense of your actions? Now we're going to Ibado-san's story. Ibado-san. While at Tokyo University, I learned logic, and I primarily learned the logic of Kant. Particularly, Kant's idea of human dignity had a definite influence on my life, I think. And to go into specifics, I entered the army, and particularly when people would say, day in and day out, be punished with beatings as part of what was called recruitment training into the Japanese Emperor's army. Though I was slapped in the face, I did not yield, and I was able to live the army life. Even if I went to the front and did terrible things, and they did a lot of them, for me, myself, doing even one of those things is too many. But as I just mentioned, there is the fact that a superior's orders is emperor's orders. And so if you execute such a thing, you yourself cannot live on. But we lost. And if we were to rephrase it, it also didn't act on my conscience. The fact that I committed those crimes, well, the biggest regret of my life. Well, we intellectuals, you see, there's something common in the intellectuals in the Japanese army. All of these war crimes, we simply can't approve of them. Therefore, the intelligent or intellectual soldiers, I don't think they committed any war crimes, but what was ordered by their superiors, They didn't do anything else. But, well, since I'm speaking from the present, if you really thought seriously about the contradictions of daily life, you would have a nervous breakdown. So in the context of war, in order to keep that at bay, well, you place yourself outside of the war, put yourself out of bounds. So although in reality you're participating in a war of aggression, you yourself are separate. You've, left yourself in a make-believe world. In other words, you have an aggressive war, and even while you participate in that, the intellectuals, how do I put it? They say that they are something apart from this aggressive war. And I, to talk about myself now, I took the position that I was doing a sort of rehearsal. So in order to escape from the world that was this painful war, for instance, I didn't come for the purpose of killing people. I came for the beautiful scenery, or to connect with the natural side of the country, and to find my raison d'etre, or something like that. I escaped into thoughts like that. That's what I think. So I wrote it in my own record of war. I think that I myself was like that, But in the end, well, I committed great crimes. Do you understand? One time, in prison camp in Siberia, I was called in by a Soviet political staff member and my very best friend. In other words, he compelled me to betray him. He had long ago been a police officer in Manchukuo. And if this leaked out, if they learned this, he wouldn't be able to go home, and he'd reveal all of this to them. That political staff member was telling me to look into a personal history, his career history, and report back at all. He told me it was an order and threatened me, but my conscience rejected this. Even if it's an order, I can't do it, I said. He was furious. Leave, he said, but I won't let you go home. And at that time, I fell into a depression for a bit. But then I remembered in my heart something I'd studied in the past. Kant's epitaph. On his tombstone, what is that? That's not how you pronounce that word. His epitaph? Oh, man. I'm sorry, guys. I can't read a word and not know how to say it properly. I don't want to read a word to you guys around.
Epitaph.
I was right. Epitaph. Okay. His epitaph, Ibado-san quotes, 2 things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe. The more often and perseveringly my thinking engages itself with them, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. When I refused that order in the Soviet Union, well, I didn't mean to do anything that would end up in my not being able to go home. No way. However, when you put it like that, it seems so hopeless. But at the same time, I was like okay with it. I thought to have obeyed my conscience is to have done the right thing. So that's funny that he does it. Like he separates himself so he can commit war crimes, but he won't turn in his friend because that's against his moral and ethics. What the fuck? That's the experience I had. Yeah. So that was the very best experience to have occurred in my life. Well, why didn't... I suppose it's time for which I most want to praise myself. That's what it is. Well, you should have done that when they were killing children with bayonets. The defense of Posey. Sir Philip Sidney describes the tyrant Alexander Furiosos, from whose eyes a tragedy well made and represented drew abundance of tears, who without all pity had murdered infinite numbers, in some of his own blood, so as he that was not ashamed to make matters for tragedies, yet could not resist the sweet violence of tragedy. In the West for some time, it seemed a contradiction that in the Holocaust, highly cultured people could do barbaric things. How was such horror possible? Bauman ventriloquizes the voices. How could it happen in the heart of the most civilized part of the world? That's a good question. The city of Weimar was home to Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Friedrich Schiller. It was also only a handful of miles from Buchenwald concentration camp. George Sempron, a survivor of Buchenwald, depicts an American soldier's astonished confrontation with Weimar's inhabitants during the camp's liberation. Your pretty town, so clean, so neat, brimming with cultural memories, the heart of classical and enlightened Germany, seems not to have had the slightest qualm about living in the smoke of Nazi crematoria. In our imperial arrogance, we have always believed that there is something fine and unique in our cultural achievements, that these have a transcendent value and therefore reveal something transcendent about us. Indeed, there are still today those who find their moral foundations shaken by the Holocaust, but not, say, by the Rwandan genocide. Again, Francois Mitterrand. In countries like that, a genocide is not very important. Mitterrand's racism is glaring and has been appropriately condemned. But according to Wol Soynicka, subtler versions of the racism regularly escape notice. He rails in particular against the argument that the Holocaust placed the first question mark on European humanism. This idea, he insists and writes, merely provides further proof that the European mind has yet to come into full cognition of the African world as an equal sector of universal humanity. For, if it had, its historic recollection would have placed the failure of European humanism centuries earlier, and that would be at the very inception of the Atlantic slave trade. This, we remind ourselves, was an enterprise that voided a continent. It is estimated as some 20 million souls and transported them across the Atlantic under conditions of brutality that have yet to be regarded by any encounter between races. Is there a version of Sir Philip Sidney's wonder at the coexistence of aesthetic sensitivity and cruelty that isn't bound up by ethnocentrism and racism? Ethnocentric. Like when you have ethnocentric thinking, it's when you judge another culture or society by your own cultural standards. So for instance, something that's ethnocentric, like living in the West, we think it's barbaric and like human rights activists hate it when the Japanese whale hunt. They've been eating whale for thousands of years. It's in their culture. Or but we think that that's barbaric. Or like how in some areas in Asia they eat dogs because it's food, or they eat bugs. We think it's gross because we're judging from our cultural standpoint. If you go into their cultural mindset and standpoint, that's totally normal. And I'm sure people from India think it's barbaric that we eat products that eat cow's meat when they don't eat cow meat. Hi, Bachman J. Broad. So ethnocentrism and ethnocentric thinking. So when we want to try to understand something that happened in another part of the world, it's good to try to drop your ethnocentric thinking and think from that culture's perspective, or at least do a little bit of research on that cultural society before you judge it or make any decisions or reactions from it. Let me start to approach this question with what we might be called the deep history of human rights in the arts. In Inventing Human Rights, Lynn Hunt makes the argument that the human rights movement was made possible by evolution's narrative practice. She claims that the modern conceptions of human rights are derived from the principles of the 18th century Western Enlightenment. which in turn were made possible or developed the way they did because of changing practices of storytelling, namely the rise of the epistolary novel. You may recall reading as an undergraduate Samuel Richardson's Pamela or Virtue Rewarded, 1740. It's the story of a young maidservant told through letters who successfully resists the sexual assaults of her master, Mr. B, and in doing so earns the reward of marriage to him. It's hard to overstate the revolutionary popularity of this novel, as it is for some readers today to understand it. In one village, Hunt writes, the inhabitants rang the church bells upon hearing the rumors that Mr. B had finally married Pamela, arguing for something like an 18th century version of the CNN effect. Ooh, I'm going to have to research that. The CNN effect. That's a good use of words. Hunt claims that widespread reading of newly available dramatic novels like this, centering on the emotions of common individuals, played an important role in developing a new sense of empathy for physically or socially distant persons. Novels made the point that all people are fundamentally similar because of their inner feelings, and many novels showcased, in particular, the desire for autonomy. In this way, reading novels created a sense of equality and empathy through passionate involvement in the narrative. Can it be coincidental that the three greatest novels of the psychological identification of the 18th century, Richardson's Pamela and Clarissa, 1747-48, and Rousseau's Julie, 1761, were all published in the period immediately preceding the appearance in the concept of rights of man? I've eaten a bug, James. I've eaten a scorpion. Margaret Cohen argues similarly that the sentimental social novel turns pity into a political or social idea. Moreover, that such novels self-consciously position themselves as participating in the march, if not battle for progress. As Lynn Festa explains, the sentimental novel's repetition and rehearsal of emotions for the disenfranchised contributed to the broad reimagination of a more inclusive human community. Novels like Pamela helped to carve out space of abstract humanity that anticipated the ideal of universality upon which revolutionary doctrine was ideally or theoretically based. It is an intuitively persuasive idea that new technologies of representation, the novel, the camera, the television, the 24-hour news network, and the internet, can produce new kinds of social relations and even new kinds of empathy. Many have criticized such arguments, however, for relying upon without fully developing a theory about how representations can perform cultural labors that bring about broad perceptual shifts. But whether or not it is true that the rise of the novel, for instance, played a role in causing the changes that made modern human rights possible, the novel as a form certainly reflects those changes. The novel, in other words, is an artistic development that is dependent upon certain conception of the human, individualistic, autonomous, defined less by status than by valuable interior feeling that, implicitly, all can share, a conception that is likely also a prerequisite for the modern liberal conception of natural, equal, and universal human rights. The current interest in the connection between narrative and human rights is perhaps best understood within the larger context of aesthetics and ethics and intellectual history, in the broad study of the way art provides a foundation for human dignity. The defense of poetry by what amounts to ethical consequences has a long history. Taste alone brings harmony in society, Schiller writes, because it fosters harmony in the individual. And Ludwig Wittgenstein declares, ethics and aesthetics are one and the same. Writing after the French Revolution, William Wordsworth finds in the pleasure of poetry an acknowledgement of the beauty of the universe, homage paid to the native and naked dignity of man, to the grand elementary principle of pleasure, by which he knows and feels and lives and moves. This pleasure, he writes, is itself the foundation of universal human sympathy. In spite of difference of soil and climate, of language and manners, of laws and customs, the poet binds together by passion and knowledge the vast empire of human society, as it is spread over the whole earth and over time. Hi, Renee! Hope everyone's doing well that joined. This romantic view of art, long dormant, has resurged of late in a series of scholarly works arguing that the aesthetic as a category helps us develop richer lives and better social arrangements. Helen Vendler, drawing upon the poet Wallace Stevens, explains that art brings us into a pervasive being. To lack a pervasive being is to fail to live fully. A pervasive being is one that extends beyond the brain, the body, the senses, and the will, and being that spreads to every moment, so that one not only feels what Keats called the poetry of earth, but responds to it with creative motions of one's own. Okay, this is a little too wordy for the author to be explaining human rights. Skari argues that the transcendent experience of beauty not only deepens our personal being, it also perpetuates us for social justice. When we submit in rapture to the beautiful object, we are doing more than making it the center of our attention. We are temporarily making it the center of our universe. Beauty in this way short circuits our default self-centeredness. It makes us forget ourselves. It trains us not to only to be other regarding, but to take pleasure in the stance. Moreover, because beauty inspires us to share, we photograph it, draw it, describe it, invite others to witness it. It trains us in the fair distribution and symmetry. For Skari, fundamentally, the double meaning of fair is material rather than accidental, and fairness is justice, she argues, is the opposite of injuring. Beauty is pacific, she writes. Its reciprocal salute to continued existence. Its pact is indistinguishable from the word for peace. Beauty has enjoyed a resurgence in recent years, not only among literary and cultural critics, but also among philosophers. Marcia Mulder-Eaton argues that aesthetic response, like emotion, is tied to a cultural's moral order, and like emotions, will be used to prescribe and proscribe the sort of life one has and leads. And Martha Nussbaum highlights the links between philosophical ethics and literary aesthetics. The practices of the Greeks of the 5th and early 4th century BCs, she argues, reveals that dramatic poetry and what we now call philosophical inquiry and ethics were both typically framed by, seen as ways of pursuing a single and general question, namely, how human beings should live. Narrative art, she writes elsewhere, is a valuable resource for the formation of decent citizenship. Moreover, in developing with Sen the highly influential capabilities approach, the idea that we should evaluate principles of social organization based on how well they promote human flourishing by allowing for the functioning of universal basic capabilities, Nussbaum has emphasized the capacity for aesthetic expression as an important element in deriving universal ethics. We value art because it is essential to be free and fully development of personality and because it promotes human flourishing. Indeed, art is the basic human right, protected in Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Even the foundational texts of human rights, it may be argued, are designed according to the aesthetic principles. René Cassin, the primary drafter of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, compared the documents to the portico of a temple. In so doing, he invited us to consider how the document's form reinforces its values. The textual architecture persuades us with its stately solidity and the implications of the sacred, and its interior principles of symmetry. It is itself the principle of justice. Until recently, interestingly, literary critics, the custodians of some of the most beautiful cultural inheritances, were among those most likely to treat the category of the beautiful with maximum suspicion. Skari, an English professor, argues. Oh, I almost closed out the window. Argues that throughout the 1980s and 1990s, beauty was banished from conversation except insofar as it was a subject of political critique. Suspicion indeed remains the default stance among many literary critics to this day, for at least two reasons. First, because conceptions of beauty determine what is the most worthy of attention and care, and also determine what is least worthy of attention and care. Judgments like these are always a matter of politics, but with the beautiful, we are invited to experience them as a matter of natural. Second, cultural artifacts such as novels and tragedies well made, or even treaties and international covenants, are able to naturalize certain views on what it is to be human precisely because their beauty, their aura of transcendence, makes us receive them uncritically. One way or another, they train individuals and communities to perceive and judge racial, sexual, gender, class, and national identity in others and in themselves. Joseph Slaughter points to a striking example. Analyzing UN debates over the proposed Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Slaughter gives particular focus to the argument generated around Article 29. Everyone has duties to the community in which alone the free and full development of his personality is possible. Ferdinand de Haas, Belgium's delegate, objects to a version of the community-oriented language, citing Daniel Defoe's classic novel, Robinson Crusoe. In his effort to justify his position, man, the novel shows, does not need a community to freely develop his personality. Isolated, self-inventing, concerned with his own freedoms and possessions rather than with his duty to others. De Haas's Crusoe is an embodiment of the negative model of liberal personhood so often criticized by communication scholars. With this high-profile invocation of Crusoe, we see the cultural training and biases that were... I'm not this getting dry. We see the cultural trainings and biases that were responsible for the U.S. demotion of economic, social, and cultural rights over the next several decades. Indeed, scholars such as Slaughter see hints of Western cultural imperialism that infuses a human rights regime. As Edwards said, writes, the prototypical modern realistic novel is Robinson Crusoe, and certainly not accidentally, it is about a European who creates a fiefdom for himself on a distant non-European island. Human rights as a rhetorical form is one of our great contemporary moral beauties. In a recent special issue of PMLA, Publications of the Modern Language Association, the flagship journal of literary criticisms on human rights and the humanities, Samara Esmar explains why so many scholars are so quick to resist its allure. International human rights law, she argues, transforms humanity into a juridical status, which precedes rather than follows and describes all humans. In other words, law aspires to call into existence and to constitute a human who would otherwise remain non-human. It thereby risks erasing all other humanities, not only in imposing its particular version of humanity, but also, and more crucially, in erasing their past existence before the law's intervention. In a similar vein, Slaughter writes that international human rights are necessary but suspicious vehicles that project a new universal international citizen subjectivity. Though monadic, self-sufficient Enlightenment individualism, historically narrow genetic universalism, and residual nationalism. Fenchey emphasizes that such criticisms are not attempts to dismiss the value contribution of human rights discourse, but rather to understand its full complexity. Rights, Che argues, to find who we are as actors within global capitalism, thus suturing us into its inequalities. But they also provide our only way for mobilizing against these inequalities. Rights, he warns, are violent gifts. Oh, man. We are so close. I'm looking. Literally, that's how much we have left to read is this little bit. I think I'm going to stop there for today. And then tomorrow will be the last day. And then we read a book. I promise the next book will be more interesting. So, yep, it's a holiday today if you're in the United States. Well, not today, tomorrow, July 4th. So I hope everybody's having a good weekend. I am not doing anything. I'm going to relax. I've been studying Japanese. I've been editing the new video. Maybe I can finish editing it today so it can come out tomorrow. It's on Tsutomu Miyazaki, or the Otaku Killer. Very creepy, very sadistic. So I'm really excited to share that with you guys. I know this one has so much info, but I feel like it's good that it's broken up, but then I feel like it's too wordy. Like, too many wordy words next to words. The next book will be fun. It'll have, like, different types of subcultures in Japan. Oh, but this one will take fucking forever to read. And then I have to respond to all the YouTube comments. But yeah, I'm going to try to get that one video out for tomorrow, or maybe it could be today. Who knows? Oh, God. And last night, thank you to everyone who came into my Discord. We watched the 2012 film, The Flowers of War, featuring Christian Bale. We cried our eyes out. We learned a lot. And it's actually based on a novel, well, a diary, a novel or whatever, on a true story. So I was thinking about researching that and telling you guys a little bit about that, because it's a very good movie. Very interesting. I know Valley Girl and Ray J watched it with me yesterday. Ray J thought it was good, so, and Effie too. So it was a very good movie. It made me cry a lot. Is there a lag in the chat? But yeah, I am going to end up going. I think everybody in here is in my Discord. If not, I will send out the link because I'm thinking of watching another movie tomorrow. So, Flowers of War. It was made in 2012. That's the link to the Discord if you're not in it, because sometimes we watch movies. So, well, I've been streaming almost an hour. I'm going to go. I might go get something to eat. I ruined my diet already. I'm terrible. Yeah, maybe we'll do one tonight. I keep having these people that say we're going to go on dates and then we never do. Like, I don't need a pen pal. I want human interaction. Not necessarily physical. I just want to talk to somebody in person. Not that not talking to you guys online is great, but I need human interaction. So for those of you in the United States, have a happy holiday weekend. Happy 4th tomorrow. Everybody have a good day. I'll be in my Discord sporadically throughout the day. I love you guys, and everyone have a good one. Bye-bye.